Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we drift back nearly 8 centuries to a frozen sliver of the world where the wind never quite stops complaining and where a young man is about to be squeezed between two of the most terrifying forces the medieval mind could imagine. Picture it. You are standing on a low wooden rampart somewhere in northern Russia, and your breath hangs in the air like smoke. To your west, across the pale birch forests, come armored knights on heavy horses' crosses stitched to their cloaks, absolutely convinced that God has personally invited them to redecorate your homeland. To your east, across the endless grass of the steppe, comes something worse. A tidal wave of riders whose empire already stretches farther than any the earth has ever seen. And you, my friend, are caught precisely in the middle, which is historically the least comfortable place a person can be. Now, I want to be honest with you before we go any further. If you had actually lived through this, you probably would not have survived it. The odds were genuinely dreadful. Whole cities in this story vanish into ash between one paragraph and the next. So enjoy the comfort of being a spectator, wrapped in blankets. Several hundred years, and one comfortable mattress removed from the nearest invading horde. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. So drop your location and your local time in the comments, and let us see how far tonight's story travels. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So let us set the stage properly, because you cannot appreciate the man until you understand the trap he was born into. The land you are standing in has a name, though its people barely think of it as a single country yet. They call it the land of the Rus, a loose scattering of principalities, stitched together by rivers, trade, and a shared faith, but constantly tearing themselves apart over who gets to sit on which slightly larger chair. This is important. The Rus of this era are not a unified kingdom marching in step. They are more like a very large, very argumentative family reunion where every cousin owns a fortress and a grudge, and nobody can agree on whose turn it is to be in charge. Into this squabbling patchwork, imagine a pressure arriving from two sides at once. From the east, the Mongols. You have heard the name, and your instincts are correct to shiver. They are not merely raiders looking for loot and a quick exit. They are empire builders, methodical and patient, with siege engineers, spies, and a bureaucracy that would honestly make a modern tax office weep with envy. When the Mongols decide to take your city, they do not simply want your gold. They want your submission recorded, filed, and renewed annually. And from the west, a different flavor of ambition entirely dressed in the language of holiness. The knights coming through those birch forests belong to crusading orders and Scandinavian kingdoms who have looked at the eastern edge of Europe and decided that these Orthodox Christians are practically pagans anyway, and would therefore benefit enormously from a firm military correction. It is one of history's quieter ironies that the men carrying the cross toward you consider you a heathen, even though you too kneel before Christ, merely in a different church with different chants. Here is your open question for the night the kind scholars still chew on over strong coffee. Historians still argue whether the Western push against the Rus was truly a religious crusade in the Pope's grand vision, or simply ordinary land-hungry lords borrowing sacred vocabulary to justify grabbing valuable Rus, fur trading routes. Faith and real estate, as it turns out, have always been remarkably good at holding hands. Now here is your mainstream anchor, the fact you can lean on. The man at the center of tonight's tale is Alexander, later remembered by a nickname earned in battle, Nevsky, meaning of the Neva, after a river where something rather dramatic happens later in our story. Do not worry, we are not skipping ahead. I am simply promising you that the payoff exists. And because I cannot resist handing you something strange, here is your quirky little morsel to tuck under your pillow. Alexander's fame grew so enormous in later centuries that he was eventually made an official saint, and centuries after that, a certain very famous filmmaker turned his story into a movie so stirring that a hardened political leader supposedly wept while watching it, then quietly shelved the film for a while when the political winds changed, then dusted it off again when the winds changed back. A man who spent his life balancing between two mortal enemies ended up fittingly balanced between propaganda campaigns long after his death. He simply could not catch a break, even as a corpse. But all of that is far ahead of us. Tonight we begin at the beginning with a boy who has not yet earned a single legend, standing in a cold hall listening to grown men argue about survival. You can feel the weight of it already, can you not? Two enemies, one young prince, a land too divided to defend itself and too proud to admit it. The question hanging over everything, the one that will shape the next 20 sleepy sections of our story, is deceptively simple. When a man cannot possibly defeat both of his enemies, what does he do? Does he die gloriously fighting both? Or does he do something far harder, far less romantic, and perhaps far wiser? Hold that thought gently in your mind like a warm cup you are not quite ready to set down. Because to understand the choice, you first have to meet the child. And so we turn softly toward a small town and a small boy of very old and very dangerous blood. So picture a small town called Nevsky, tucked into the forested heart of the Rus lands, sitting beside a lake, so still on a summer evening that it looks like a sheet of hammered silver. This is where our boy enters the world sometime around the year 1220. Though I have to warn you, medieval record-keeping was a casual affair, and the exact date is one of those things nobody wrote down with the care it deserved. Historians still argue whether he was born in 1220 or a year or two on either side, which means that even the very beginning of Alexander's life comes with an asterisk. Welcome to medieval biography, where the dates are made up and the birthdays do not matter. You would not at first glance mark this infant as anything special. Babies are babies, red-faced and furious at the indignity of existence, and this one is no exception. But the blood in his veins is the important part, so let me hand you the lineage like a heavy family heirloom. Alexander belongs to the house of Rurik, a dynasty that traces itself back, at least in legend, to a Norse warlord named Rurik, who supposedly sailed into these lands generations earlier and was invited to rule because the locals were tired of fighting among themselves. Whether that invitation happened as neatly as the old chronicles claim is your quirky debate for later nights, but the point stands. By the time our Alexander is born, the Rurikid family has been the ruling bloodline of the Rus for roughly 4 centuries, which in dynasty terms is an extraordinarily long time to keep the family business running without someone burning down the office. His father is a man named Yaroslav, a prince with the restless energy of someone who is constantly acquiring, losing and reacquiring cities, like a man who cannot stop reorganizing his garage. This is your mainstream fact to hold on to. In this era, a Rus prince did not simply inherit one throne and sit on it comfortably until death. Thrones rotated. Princes moved from city to city according to a complicated seniority system that even the people living inside it found baffling. A prince might rule one town this decade, be shuffled to another the next, and spend the years in between fighting relatives over which chair was rightfully his. So young Alexander grows up watching his father pack and unpack, gain and forfeit, negotiate and campaign, absorbing the single most important lesson of his childhood before he can even properly ride a horse. Power here is not a possession. It is a performance you must repeat every single season or lose entirely. Now, childhood for a prince of this world was not the cozy affair you might imagine. There were no gentle years of playing in the mud and being told you were special. Instead, there was a ceremony, and here is your strange little morsel for the night. Rus princes underwent a ritual, sometimes called the tonsure, but not the kind where a monk shaves the top of his head. This was a warrior's rite, where a small boy, often only 2 or 3 years old, would have a lock of his hair ceremonially cut, and would then be lifted onto a horse for the first time, formally marking his transition from infant to future warrior. Imagine handing a toddler the reins of a warhorse and declaring, "Congratulations, you are now a soldier of the realm." Modern parents cannot even agree on when to give a child a phone, and here were medieval fathers strapping their 3-year-olds onto cavalry mounts and calling it Tuesday. From that moment, your childhood, little Alexander, is essentially a training program. You learn to ride before you learn most anything gentle. You learn the weight of a small sword, the discipline of the hunt, the endless memorization of who is related to whom and therefore who might someday try to kill you. You are taught to read scripture and to respect the Orthodox Church, whose priests move through your father's halls like quiet grey pillars, because faith is not separate from rule here. It is the very glue that holds a prince's legitimacy together. A ruler who loses the trust of the church loses the loyalty of his people, and so you learn early to bow your head at the right moments and to look sincere while doing it. A skill that will serve you astonishingly well in the harrowing years ahead. And the land itself teaches you. The winters here are not a mild inconvenience. They are a vast white silence that swallows roads, freezes rivers, solid enough to march an army across, and turns the world into something both beautiful and lethal. You learn that ice is not merely cold. Ice is terrain. Ice is opportunity. Ice can carry a horse or drown one, and a clever commander files that knowledge away for a day he cannot yet foresee. Tuck that thought under your blanket too, because it will matter enormously later on a certain frozen lake. By the time Alexander is a boy of perhaps 8 or 9, his father sends him and his older brother northward to begin learning the trade of ruling in one of the strangest and most important places in the entire Rus world, a merchant city that treats its princes less like divinely appointed sovereigns and more like temporary contractors hired to handle the unpleasant business of warfare. This place will become the great stage of Alexander's early legend, the city that will lift him up, throw him out in a fit of pique, and then come crawling back the moment danger returns, because gratitude, as you will see, was in dreadfully short supply. But we are not there quite yet. For now, simply hold the image of a boy shaped by motion and cold by ceremony and swordplay, by a father forever chasing thrones and a bloodline older than most kingdoms. He does not know yet that 2 civilizations are sharpening their blades in his direction. He only knows the world he was handed harsh and glittering and unforgiving, and he is learning quietly to survive it. And so, with a lock of hair cut and a horse beneath him, we ride softly northward toward that peculiar merchant republic and the tangled bargain it will offer him. So let us follow that road north, the one his father sends him down until the forests thin, and you arrive at a city, unlike anything else in the Rus world, a place called Novgorod, which loosely means new town, though by the time our story reaches it, the town is anything but new and rather smug about it. You come upon it along the Volkhov River, and the first thing that strikes you is that this is not a fortress squatting nervously in the wilderness. This is a thriving, prosperous, wildly wealthy trading hub. Its wooden wharves crowded with boats, its markets loud with a dozen languages, its warehouses stuffed with furs, wax, honey, amber, and enough silver to make a lesser city faint. Novgorod is rich in a way that most of the Rus lands simply are not, and it knows it the way a wealthy relative always somehow knows it. Here is your mainstream anchor for tonight. Novgorod was not ruled the way you would expect a medieval town to be ruled. It was in effect a republic governed by an assembly of its citizens known as the Veche, a raucous public meeting where free men gathered in the square to shout, argue, and vote on the matters of the city. Imagine a town hall meeting with the volume turned all the way up and the occasional fist fight breaking out over trade tariffs, and you are somewhere close. Decisions were made not by a single prince's decree, but by the collective bellowing of merchants, craftsmen, and landowners, which sounds charmingly democratic until you remember that the loudest and wealthiest voices tended mysteriously to win. Now here is the part that matters most for Alexander, and it is genuinely delightful. Novgorod did have princes, but it hired them, and crucially it could fire them. The Prince of Novgorod was not a sovereign lord who owned the city. He was more like a chief executive, brought in on a contract, expected to lead the army, defend the borders, and dispense a certain amount of justice, but strictly forbidden from actually owning land within the republic or meddling too deeply in its precious commerce. If the prince overstepped, if he grew too greedy or too grand, the Veche would simply gather in the square vote and show him the door. The chronicles record princes being invited in and thrown out with a frequency that would make a modern recruitment agency dizzy. One historian counted the Prince of Novgorod changing hands dozens of times across the medieval centuries, which means the job security was, to put it gently, non-existent. So imagine being a proud young man of ancient Rurikid, blood raised to believe you are practically ordained by God to command, and being handed a city that regards you as at best a highly skilled temporary employee. It is a humbling arrangement, and it teaches Alexander something his cousins in more traditional principalities never quite learned. It teaches him diplomacy. It teaches him to read a crowd, to sense the mood of the merchants, to know exactly how far he can push before the square starts muttering his name in that dangerous way. A prince who could not charm Novgorod did not last long enough to become famous. Alexander, as we will see, learned to charm it, lose it, and win it back, which is honestly a more impressive achievement than winning any single battle. And now your quirky little morsel for the pillow. Not just any bell, but a great veche bell, whose ringing summoned the citizens to assembly, and this bell became such a powerful symbol of the city's freedom and independence that centuries later, when a certain grand ruler of Moscow finally crushed Novgorod's proud self-governance, one of the very first things he did was physically remove that bell and cart it away, silencing the voice of the Republic in the most literal way imaginable. The bell was in a sense the true ruler of Novgorod, and everyone knew it. You have to admire the poetry of it, even if the acoustics of democracy were by all accounts exhausting. Historians still argue whether Novgorod was truly a democracy in any meaningful sense, or merely an oligarchy of wealthy boyar families cleverly disguised behind the theatre of public assembly, letting the common folk shout in the square, while the real decisions were quietly stitched up beforehand by a handful of powerful clans. The truth, as usual, it probably sits somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, which is where truth almost always insists on sitting. But whatever its inner workings, Novgorod had two enormous advantages that will shape everything to come. First, its wealth, which made it a tempting prize, and also gave it the means to fund armies and fortifications. And second, its geography. Novgorod sat far to the north, tucked away from the open steppe, protected by a vast web of rivers, marshes, forests, and lakes that made it extraordinarily difficult for a large cavalry army to reach. Remember this because it becomes the single most important accident of fortune in the entire Rus catastrophe that is about to unfold. When the storm from the east finally breaks, most of the Rus cities will lie exposed on open ground, easy prey for horsemen. But Novgorod, buried in its watery, muddy, the forested corner, will very nearly slip through the fingers of history's most fearsome cavalry entirely. So this is the stage upon which young Alexander is set to perform. A proud republic that treats its prince as a hired sword. A city rich enough to be worth conquering, remote enough to be hard to reach, and prickly enough to throw out any ruler who forgets his place. It is the perfect training ground for a man who will spend his whole life balancing pride against survival, ambition against humility, glory against the grim arithmetic of staying alive. He is settling into this strange bargain, this proud and difficult city, learning its moods and its politics when word begins to arrive from the distant east. Traders speak of it first in hushed and disbelieving tones. Something is moving across the steppe. Something vast. Something that burns cities the way you and I might blow out a candle. And the ground far away is beginning to tremble. So let us leave the noisy comfort of Novgorod's markets behind for a moment, and turn your gaze eastward, out past the settled forests, out beyond the last friendly river, to the great open ocean of grass that stretches on and on toward the rising sun. This is the steppe, and to the people of the Rus it has always been the direction from which trouble arrives. Nomadic raiders had come from that grass before over the centuries, and the Rus had learned to fight them, bribe them, marry into them, and occasionally lose badly to them. So when the first rumours of new horsemen drifted in, nobody panicked. Steppe raiders were, in a sense, an old and familiar house guest, unwelcome but understood. This, my friend, was a catastrophic misunderstanding, and here is your mainstream fact for the night. It was the Mongol Empire forged in the preceding decades by a leader whose name still echoes with dread. Genghis Khan, who had taken the scattered feuding tribes of the steppe and welded them into a single, disciplined, terrifyingly efficient war machine. By the time this machine turned its attention toward the Rus, Genghis himself had died, but his empire had not slowed down in the slightest. It had, if anything, accelerated now, commanded by his sons and grandsons, who inherited both his conquests and his boundless appetite for more. The Rus got their first real taste of this new enemy years before the true invasion at a river called the Kalka, and it is worth pausing here because the encounter tells you everything about why the disaster to come was so complete. A Mongol scouting force far from home had wandered into the southern steppe. Several Rus princes, along with their nomadic allies, gathered a large army to drive these strangers off, confident in their numbers. And here is your quirky little morsel. Before the battle, the Mongols reportedly sent envoys to the Rus princes proposing peace, and the princes, in a spectacular display of poor decision-making, killed the envoys. Now, the Mongols had many flexible opinions about many things, but on one point they were absolutely rigid. You did not harm their ambassadors. Ever. Killing a Mongol envoy was in their eyes roughly equivalent to declaring that you personally wished to be erased from the earth, and the Mongols were nothing if not accommodating of such wishes. The Battle of the Kulka was a massacre. The Rus forces, disorganized and quarreling as always over who was in command, were lured into a pursuit, surrounded and destroyed. And here your quirky morsel turns rather dark, so I will keep it PG. Several captured Rus princes were, according to the chronicles, executed in a grimly ceremonial fashion, crushed beneath a platform upon which the victorious Mongols sat and feasted, so that no royal blood would be spilled upon the ground, blood being considered sacred. The Mongols got to celebrate their victory and honor a superstition simultaneously, which is a level of multitasking you have to grudgingly respect. Historians still argue whether this platform execution actually happened as the chronicles describe, or was later embellishment, but the sheer horror of the defeat is not in dispute. And then, having shattered a major Rus army and thoroughly announced their arrival, the Mongols simply turned around and rode home. This is the detail that lulled the Rus into fatal complacency. The scouts had come, tested the defences and left. Life resumed. The princes went back to squabbling over their chairs. Surely, they told themselves, those strange eastern horsemen had been a passing storm, now safely rolled away over the horizon. But the Mongols did not raid. They surveyed. That expedition to the Kulka was reconnaissance, a careful gathering of intelligence about the lands, the roads, the rivers, and the fractured, disunited enemies of the West. The Mongols were patient in a way that the Rus simply could not comprehend, thinking not in seasons but in decades, planning conquests the way a chessmaster plans an endgame. They filed away everything they learned and returned to the great councils of the empire, where the decision was made. The western lands would be taken, and a grandson of Genghis, a capable and ambitious commander named Batu, would be given the honor of taking them. Here is your mainstream anchor to hold firmly. When the true invasion came, it was not a raid. It was a campaign of conquest, meticulously organized, supported by siege engineers who had learned the art of breaking walls from the conquered cities of China and Central Asia. The Mongols brought catapults and knowledge of gunpowder-adjacent incendiaries, techniques for storming fortifications that the Rus, whose warfare was still largely a matter of horsemen and wooden stockades, had no answer for. When you imagine the horde, do not picture a wild mob. Picture instead a coordinated force with scouts, supply, trains, engineers, and a command structure so disciplined that units could execute complex maneuvers across enormous distances using signal flags and drums. It was in many ways the most advanced military organization on the planet, and it was rolling directly toward a collection of proud, wealthy, hopelessly divided city-states who still thought of it as a nuisance. And where is our young Alexander during all of this? Far to the north, still learning the delicate art of managing Novgorod, still a young man rather than a legend, watching from a relative safety that he cannot yet appreciate. The catastrophe that is about to consume the southern and central Rus will largely spare his corner of the world, protected by those marshes and forests we spoke of. But he will grow up in the long shadow it casts, and the lesson of it will burn itself into his mind. He will watch from a distance as the greatest cities of his people are reduced to smoking ruin, and he will draw from that horror a conclusion that will define his entire life. Against this enemy, courage alone is suicide. Against this enemy, pride is a luxury no one can afford. But before he can learn that lesson, the storm must break in full. And so we turn now with heavy hearts and quiet voices toward the winter, when the horde arrived in earnest and the burning began. So imagine now the deep of winter that season. We spoke of earlier, when the rivers freeze into solid highways, and the snow muffles the whole world into silence. For the Rus, winter had always been a shield. Their forests and marshes turned to impassable mud in the warm months, and armies bogged down, horses floundered, and invaders gave up. But the Mongols, clever and patient, understood something the Rus had never had to fear before. They understood that a frozen river is not an obstacle, it is a road. And so while the Rus huddled by their fires, assuming the cold protected them, the horde came riding in across the ice, using the very frozen waterways that crisscrossed the land as smooth avenues straight to the gates of every city. The shield had become a doorway, and the enemy simply walked through it. The first great city to face the full storm was Ryazan, and here is your mainstream fact delivered gently, because it is a heavy one. When the Mongols arrived outside its walls, they sent, as was their custom, a demand for submission and tribute, asking for a portion of everything the city owned. The people of Ryazan, proud and defiant, reportedly answered that if they were all dead, then the Mongols could have everything. It was a brave answer. It was also tragically taken quite literally. The siege lasted only a matter of days. The Mongol engineers surrounded the city with a wooden palisade to trap everyone inside, then battered the walls with siege engines around the clock until they broke. What followed was the grim fate the Mongols reserved for cities that resisted. And I will spare you the details and simply say that when it was over, the old Ryazan was gone so completely that it was never truly rebuilt on the same spot. A new town rose later nearby and borrowed the name, but the original had been erased from the living map. Here is your quirky little morsel, and it is one of those defiant legends that people cling to in the aftermath of catastrophe. The chronicles tell of a warrior of Ryazan named Yevpati, who had been away when the city fell and who returned to find his home a smoking ruin and his family gone. Consumed with grief and fury, he gathered a small band of survivors, a mere handful against an empire, and rode after the departing horde, falling upon their rearguard with such berserk ferocity that the Mongols, unable to understand where these ghosts kept coming from, supposedly believed they were fighting the risen dead. The story ends the only way it can, with Yevpati overwhelmed. But the Mongol commander was said to be so impressed by his courage that he released the surviving captives out of respect. Historians still argue whether Yevpati existed at all, or is a folk hero stitched together from the wishful grief of a broken people. But you can understand why a shattered nation needed to believe that at least one man made the horde afraid. From Ryazan, the campaign rolled on, methodical and relentless. City after city faced the same terrible arithmetic: submit and be plundered, or resist and be annihilated. The great city of Vladimir, seat of Alexander's own extended family, one of the proudest centers of Rus power, fell next. Its people, along with members of the ruling family and clergy, took refuge in the great stone cathedral, hoping its sacred walls would offer protection. The Mongols, unmoved by the sanctity of the place, piled wood around it and set it alight, and those inside perished in the smoke and flame. It is one of the most haunting images of the entire invasion, an entire community huddled together in prayer as the fire took them, and it is your mainstream anchor for understanding just how total this catastrophe was. This was not warfare, as the Rus knew it, with its ransoms and its negotiated surrenders. This was conquest, as erasure, and then sometime later came the greatest wound of all, the fall of Kiev. Now Kiev was not just another city. Kiev was the mother of Rus cities, the ancient spiritual and political heart of the entire civilization, the place where the Rus had first accepted Christianity, the glittering capital whose golden domes had once been the pride of all the Eastern Slavic world. When Kiev fell, something more than a city died. An era died. A visiting envoy who passed through the region not long afterward described the land around Kiev as a graveyard, with countless skulls and bones lying scattered across the fields, and the once magnificent city reduced to a pitiful cluster of houses. The heart of the Rus had stopped beating. What remained in the wake of all this burning was a new and grim reality that would define Alexander's entire adult life. The Mongols did not, for the most part, occupy the Rus lands directly with permanent garrisons. Instead, they established their dominance from a distance, ruling through fear, tribute, and the threat of return. Their western realm, centered on the lower Volga River, became known as the Golden Horde, and from their capital, they demanded that the surviving Rus princes come to them, bow before them, and receive permission to continue ruling their own devastated lands as vassals. The princes of the Rus were no longer sovereigns. They were subjects, tax collectors for a distant Khan, permitted to keep their thrones only so long as they knelt. Here is your quirky, almost unbearable little detail. The very word that entered the Slavic languages for this era of domination carries the weight of a bridle and a harness, the imagery of a people yoked like animals, and it lingered in the cultural memory for centuries, shaping how the Rus and their descendants saw themselves always with one wary eye, turned toward the steppe. And through all of this devastation, remember, our Alexander's northern corner had been largely spared, protected by those marshes, and the spring thaw that finally halted the horde's advance before it reached Novgorod. He had survived. But he had watched, and the lesson was seared into him forever. Now, into that broken and defenseless land, a second predator began to stir. Sensing that the wounded Rus might be easy prey. This time the danger came not from the east, but from the west. So turn now and let your gaze swing all the way around, away from the smoking ruins of the east and toward the setting sun, because while the Rus lay bleeding beneath the horde, other eyes were watching from the west, and they did not see a tragedy. They saw an opportunity. Nothing draws predators quite like the scent of a wounded animal, and the Rus, staggering and half destroyed, had begun to bleed in a way that carried on the wind all the way to the courts and cathedrals of Latin Christendom. Where you and I might look at a devastated people and feel pity, certain ambitious men of the medieval West looked and felt something closer to appetite. Now, to understand who was coming, you have to understand the peculiar flavor of the age. This was the era of Crusades, when the idea of holy war had become one of the great organizing passions of Western Europe. For generations, knights had been marching off to distant lands to fight for the faith, or at least for what they had convinced themselves was the faith. And the crusading impulse had spread far beyond its original targets. Here is your mainstream fact, and it is a crucial one for understanding the tragedy of it all. The Rus were Christians. They had been Christians for centuries, but they belonged to the Eastern Orthodox Church, which had by this time formally split from the Roman Catholic Church of the West in a great schism that divided Christendom into two rival branches, each convinced the other had wandered into error. And so, in the eyes of the crusading West, these Orthodox Christians of the Rus were not quite brothers in faith. They were schismatics, heretics, or worse, and bringing them forcibly under the authority of Rome could be dressed up quite conveniently as holy work. Three distinct forces were gathering along that western frontier, and it is worth introducing each of your future antagonists properly. First came the Swedes, a vigorous Scandinavian kingdom that had long cast its gaze across the Baltic Sea toward the rich lands and trade routes of the northeast. For the Swedes, expansion into Rus territory promised control of lucrative rivers and coastlines, all conveniently blessed by the language of converting the heathen. Second and more formidable came the great crusading military orders, chief among them the Teutonic Knights, and their regional branch sometimes remembered as the Livonian Order. These were not ordinary soldiers. Here is your quirky little morsel to tuck away. The Teutonic Knights were essentially warrior monks, men who had taken religious vows of poverty and chastity, while also being among the most heavily armoured and professionally trained killing machines in all of Europe. Imagine a monastery that also functioned as an elite military academy, where the brothers prayed their psalms in the morning and drilled cavalry charges in the afternoon. And you begin to grasp the strange and fearsome nature of these men. They wore white mantles marked with black crosses, and they had already carved out a substantial territory along the Baltic coast, converting or crushing the pagan tribes there, with a zeal that made no fine distinction between spreading the gospel and seizing land. And behind both of these forces loomed the third and most abstract power of all, the ambition of the papacy itself, the Pope in distant Rome, who saw in the weakened Rus a golden chance to extend the authority of the Roman Church eastward to heal the schism not through gentle persuasion but through the pressure of the sword. Papal letters of the period encouraged crusading efforts against the northeastern lands, framing the Orthodox Rus as legitimate targets for conversion and conquest. The blessing of Rome transformed a naked land grab into a sacred mission, and there is nothing quite so dangerous as a man who believes his greed is godliness. Here is your open scholarly debate for the night, and it is a genuinely fascinating one. Historians still argue whether these Western campaigns constituted a coordinated, unified crusade, deliberately timed to strike the Rus while they were reeling from the Mongols, or whether they were simply a loose collection of separate, opportunistic ventures that happened to overlap in time and target. Some scholars paint a picture of grand strategy, a pincer movement of faith closing in on the wounded East. Others argue more soberly that the Swedes had their own local ambitions, the Teutonic Knights had theirs, and the Pope had his, and that they were never nearly so coordinated as later legend and later nationalist storytelling liked to imagine. The truth may be that the Rus faced not a single conspiracy but a convergence, several sharks arriving at the same wounded swimmer, not because they planned it together but because they all smelled the same blood. Whatever the degree of coordination, the effect for the Rus was the same, and it was dreadful in its symmetry. To the east, the Mongols demanded submission of the body tribute and obedience and the humiliation of kneeling before a foreign Khan. But the Mongols, for all their ferocity, were generally indifferent to religion. They did not care what god you prayed to, so long as you paid your taxes and did not kill their envoys. The West, by contrast, demanded submission of the soul. It wanted the Rus to abandon their church, their faith, their very spiritual identity, and bend the knee to Rome. And this, in a strange and telling way, is the key to understanding the terrible choice that Alexander would eventually make, the choice that has haunted his reputation ever since. For a man who cared deeply about the orthodox faith of his people, the Eastern threat, however brutal, left the soul intact, while the Western threat aimed straight at the heart of everything he believed made his people who they were. But all of that reckoning lies ahead. For now, simply feel the walls closing in from both directions, the horde behind and the Crusaders before, and understand that into this impossible vice a young man was about to step forward and take command. The Swedes were already fitting out their boats, and they were pointing their prows toward a river you have heard named before, a river that would give a young prince his legend and his name. So let us return now to that young man, no longer quite a boy, standing in the halls of Novgorod as the world darkens around him from both directions. Alexander has grown into his role, and here is where you begin to see the shape of the leader emerging from the child. We met with a lock of hair cut and a horse beneath him. By the time the Western threat begins to sharpen into something real, Alexander is a young prince in his late teens, formally installed as the leader of Novgorod's forces, and already tasting the full maddening complexity of the job we described earlier. The impossible position of being a proud Rurikid, asked to serve a city that regards him as hired help. Here is your mainstream fact for the night. Alexander did not rule Novgorod as an absolute lord. He shared power uneasily and constantly with the Veshe, that roaring assembly of merchants and landowners, and with the powerful boyar families who truly controlled the city's wealth and politics. His authority rested primarily on one thing: his role as war leader, the man who commanded the Druzhina, the professional band of warriors who formed the core of any Rus prince's fighting strength. So long as danger threatened and the city needed a sword, Alexander had leverage. But he had to be careful never to overstep, never to reach too greedily for the reins of commerce or land or governance that Novgorod jealously reserved for itself. It was a tightrope, and he was learning to walk it, though, as we will soon see, he had not yet mastered the trick of staying on the wire. Picture the daily reality of it. You are young, ambitious, aware of your ancient bloodline and the glory it seems to promise, and yet every significant decision requires you to negotiate with gruff merchants who care more about the price of furs than the honor of prince. You must attend the assembly and hold your tongue while men of lower birth debate your proposals. You must charm the boyars, court the clergy, and reassure the common folk, all while your own instincts scream at you to simply command and be obeyed. Historians still argue whether Alexander genuinely enjoyed this delicate political dance, or merely endured it as a necessary evil. But there is little doubt that Novgorod's peculiar culture forced upon him a patience and a subtlety that most warrior princes of the age never had to develop. The city was, in a strange way, his finishing school in the art of the possible. And now your quirky little morsel for the pillow. For all his later fame as a warrior, Alexander seems to have understood something that eluded many of his contemporaries: the value of information and diplomacy over brute force. The chronicles suggest he maintained watchers and informants along the frontiers, so that when enemies moved he would know. There is even a tradition that he cultivated relationships with the local Finnic and Baltic peoples who lived along the coasts and rivers, people often overlooked by the grand princes, but who saw everything that passed through their lands. It was reportedly through such humble, watchful eyes that the first warning of the Swedish approach would eventually reach him, a reminder that empires are often saved not by heroes on horseback but by some anonymous fisherman noticing unfamiliar sails on the horizon and deciding it was worth mentioning to someone important. Consider, too, the psychological weight pressing down on this young man. He has watched from his protected northern corner as the greatest cities of his people were reduced to ash and bone. He knows what the horde did to Ryazan, to Vladimir, to Kiev. He carries the knowledge of that eastern catastrophe like a stone in his chest, and it shapes his every calculation. He understands, in a way that his more hot-headed peers do not, that the Ruslands cannot afford to fight everyone at once. The wounded body of his people simply cannot survive a war on two fronts. Somewhere in these formative years, the seed of his defining strategy is planted, the grim, unromantic logic that will one day make him bow to the Mongols while fighting the West. He is beginning to think not like a hero seeking glory, but like a physician trying to keep a dying patient alive, choosing which limb to sacrifice so that the whole may survive. But do not imagine him as merely cautious or cold. This is a young man, remember, with fire in his blood and the pride of ancient kings. And when the moment for action comes, he will move with a speed and decisiveness that will stun everyone around him. The patience he learned in Novgorod's assembly did not extinguish his boldness. It disciplined it. It taught him to wait, to watch, and then, when the instant was right, to strike like lightning. That combination, the diplomat's patience wedded to the warrior's ferocity, is rare in any age, and it is the quality that is about to lift Alexander out of obscurity and into legend. Here is your mainstream anchor to carry into the next section. In the summer of the year 1240, when Alexander was still only around 20 years old, the first of the two Western threats finally materialized in the flesh. A Swedish expedition carried in ships and reportedly accompanied by bishops and crusading zeal sailed up into the rivers of the northern Rus, landing at the mouth of a tributary where the river Izora meets the greater river Neva. Their intentions were plain enough: to establish a foothold, to seize control of the vital waterways, and perhaps, if all went well, to march on Novgorod itself and bring the schismatic city to heel. They set up their camp on the riverbank, confident and unhurried, apparently believing that the shattered Rus posed no serious danger and that they had all the time in the world. They were wrong. Word of their landing was already racing toward Novgorod, carried by those watchful frontier eyes we spoke of. And in the city, a young prince was about to make the decision that would define him forever. He would not wait for the enemy to come to him. He would not gather a vast army and lumber slowly into position. He would take what men he had, and he would move now fast, before the Swedes even understood the danger they were in. So let us stand now on the banks of the Neva in the long, pale light of a northern summer, where the sun barely troubles to set and the nights glow with a soft, lingering twilight. The Swedish force has made camp along the river, their ships drawn up on the shore, their tents pitched, their fires lit. Picture the scene as they would have seen it: a successful landing, no enemy in sight. The vast, quiet forests of the Rus, stretching away in every direction. They are relaxed. They are confident. Some of the leaders, according to tradition, have retired to a grand tent to rest and plan. And here is the delicious irony that sits at the heart of this whole episode. They believe they have all the time in the world, precisely because they have so badly underestimated the young man now racing toward them. Here is your mainstream fact for the night. When word of the Swedish landing reached Novgorod, Alexander did not summon the full might of the city or wait to assemble a great host. Time was the one resource he could not spare. He gathered his own druzhina, his personal band of professional warriors, along with what volunteers from Novgorod he could rally quickly, and he moved with astonishing speed toward the enemy. Speed was everything. If the Swedes had time to fortify their position, to organize, to understand the threat, the advantage would slip away. But if he could reach them before they were ready, a smaller force striking a larger one by surprise might just carry the day. It was a gamble that depended entirely on the enemy remaining ignorant and comfortable, and the enemy obliged him beautifully. Now your quirky little morsel, and it is a wonderful one wrapped in the language of the miraculous. The chronicles tell that on the morning before the battle, a man named Pelgusius, a local of the Ishora people who had been keeping watch along the coast, experienced a vision. He supposedly saw a ghostly boat gliding across the water, carrying two shining figures, identified as the sainted brothers, Boris and Gleb, revered early Rus martyrs, who declared that they had come to help their kinsman Alexander against his foes. Whether you take this as a genuine mystical experience, a morale-boosting tale invented afterward, or simply the overactive imagination of a nervous sentry who had been awake far too long, it did its job. Historians still argue whether such visions were sincerely believed by medieval warriors, or cynically deployed by chroniclers to cloak a military victory in divine approval. But there is no doubt that in an age of deep faith, the conviction that heaven itself rode beside you was worth more than any number of extra soldiers. And then in the golden haze of that summer morning, Alexander struck. He fell upon the Swedish camp with the full shock of surprise, his cavalry crashing into the unprepared enemy before they could form a proper defensive line. Imagine the chaos from the Swedish side, men scrambling for weapons and armor, horses panicking, the neat order of a confident camp dissolving in an instant into desperate confusion. The fighting was fierce, but the momentum belonged entirely to the attackers. The Rus warriors drove toward the ships and the command tents, and the legend naturally gives its finest moment to Alexander himself. Here is your mainstream anchor, the deed that echoes through every retelling. Tradition holds that Alexander personally fought his way to the leader of the Swedish host and struck him a wound to the face with his spear, a blow described in the chronicles, in vivid, almost cinematic terms, marking the enemy commander with the seal of his defeat. Whether it happened exactly so, a single dramatic duel amid the swirling battle, or whether the chroniclers simply gave their hero a suitably heroic climax, the image stuck, and it became central to the legend of the young prince who led from the very front, sharing every danger with his men. The battle did not last long. Surprise and momentum are devastating advantages, and the Swedes, unable to recover from the initial shock, broke. Those who could fled to their ships and pushed off into the river, abandoning the enterprise entirely. The invasion that had promised to seize the vital waterways and perhaps humble Novgorod itself collapsed in the space of a single morning, undone by one young man's willingness to move faster and strike harder than anyone thought possible. And here, on the banks of this river, our prince earns the name by which history would forever remember him: the Neva. Alexander of the Neva. Alexander Nevsky. From this day forward, that battlefield epithet would cling to him, a permanent badge of the victory that first announced his greatness to the world. It is one of those rare moments where you can point to a single morning and say that is where the legend was born, where an ambitious young prince became a name that would outlive kingdoms. Now, I must be honest with you, because we care about truth here, even at bedtime. Some modern historians look at the Battle of the Neva and gently note that it may have been a relatively modest skirmish, blown up by later chroniclers and by centuries of national mythology into something grander than the actual fighting warranted. The Swedish sources, curiously, say very little about a catastrophic defeat, which some take as evidence that the clash, while real, was smaller than the glorious Rus accounts suggest. Historians still argue over its true scale, and you are free to hold both truths at once: that it was a genuine and clever victory, and that legend, as legend always does, polished it into something shining and enormous. But whatever its precise size, the effect on Alexander's reputation was immediate and immense. He was overnight the hero of the hour, the young prince who had defended the north, the man touched by the favor of saints, the victor of the Neva. You might imagine such a triumph would secure his position forever, that a grateful Novgorod would shower him with honor and beg him to rule for the rest of his days. You would be forgetting, of course, exactly what kind of city Novgorod was, and you would be forgetting how very short the memory of a grateful crowd can be. So here is where our story takes a turn so absurd that you would be forgiven for thinking I invented it to keep you entertained. Our young hero, fresh from his glittering victory on the Neva, his name already becoming legend, his reputation soaring, is at the very height of his triumph. And what does the grateful city of Novgorod do with its brilliant young savior? the man who just crushed a foreign invasion in a single morning and turned back a threat to their very independence. They throw him out. Yes, out. Not long after the Battle of the Neva, Alexander finds himself in a bitter quarrel with the leading men of Novgorod, and the outcome of that quarrel is that the hero of the hour packs his things and departs the city in anger, retreating to his family's lands elsewhere. Now I know what you are thinking, snuggled there under your blanket. That makes no sense. Who fires the man who just saved them? But you have to remember everything we learned about this peculiar republic. Remember how Novgorod treated its princes not as sovereigns but as hired contractors, and remember that roaring assembly, the Veshe, where the loudest merchants and the proudest boyars settled matters by shouting each other down. Here is your mainstream fact for the night, and it is essential to understanding the man. Alexander's power in Novgorod always rested on that uneasy, shifting bargain between the prince and the city. When danger loomed, the city wanted a strong war leader and would tolerate his ambitions. But the moment the danger passed, that very same strength became threatening. A victorious, popular, confident prince was precisely the kind of man the jealous boyars feared, because a hero might start getting ideas above his station, might reach for real power, might try to become an actual ruler rather than a temporary sword for hire. So the mechanics of his fall were entirely predictable, even if the ingratitude of it stings. With the immediate Swedish threat gone, the leading families of Novgorod grew wary of their too successful young commander. There were disputes likely over authority, over the prince's role, over how much say Alexander should have in the city's affairs now that he had proven himself. And in a city where the prince served at the pleasure of the assembly, such disputes had only one possible resolution. The proud young victor, unwilling to be diminished, and the proud old city, unwilling to be overshadowed, reached an impasse, and Alexander withdrew. Here is your quirky little morsel to savour. This was not even the first or last time Novgorod would treat a prince this way, nor was Alexander the only member of his family to be shown the door. His own father had been welcomed and expelled by various cities in the endless rotating game we described earlier. The relationship between Novgorod and its princes was so notoriously unstable that being cast out was almost a rite of passage, a normal hazard of the job rather than a unique disgrace. Imagine a workplace where getting fired was so routine that everyone simply assumed you would be rehired eventually, and you have captured the strange rhythm of Novgorod politics. The city and its princes were locked in a kind of endless, exasperated marriage, forever storming apart and reconciling, neither quite able to live with the other, nor entirely able to live without. Historians still argue over the precise cause of this particular falling out, since the chronicles are frustratingly vague about the details. Some suggest it was a straightforward power struggle, the boyars clipping the wings of a prince who had grown too mighty. Others propose that Alexander himself, flush with victory, overplayed his hand and demanded more authority than the city was willing to grant. Still others hint at personal grievances, wounded pride on both sides, the ordinary friction of ambitious men in a small and crowded political world. We may never know exactly what words were exchanged in that assembly, but the result is not in dispute. The hero of the Neva rode away from the city he had just saved, and Novgorod, for the moment, congratulated itself on having put its uppity prince firmly in his place. And here, my friend, is where fate reveals its wicked sense of humour, because you can probably already guess what happens next. The moment Novgorod pushed away its shield, the wolves of the West sensed the opening. Remember those three Western forces we introduced: the Swedes, the papacy, and the fearsome warrior monks of the Teutonic Order. The Swedes had been dealt with on the Neva, but the Teutonic Knights, the heavily armoured crusading brotherhood with their white mantles and black crosses, had lost none of their ambition. They had been carving out territory along the Baltic for years, and now, with Novgorod having conveniently discarded its most capable defender, they saw their chance to press deep into the Rus lands. So, picture the grim comedy of the situation. Novgorod, having just triumphantly rid itself of the one man most capable of defending it, now finds a genuine existential threat marching toward it from the west. And its brilliant young general is sulking quite reasonably somewhere far away. The chronicles capture the mounting panic beautifully. The knights advance. Rus towns begin to fall. The danger grows closer and more real with each passing week. and the proud merchants and boyars of Novgorod who so recently could not wait to see the back of their arrogant prince begin to exchange nervous glances and to wonder perhaps whether they had acted just a little too hastily. There is a profound and rather satisfying lesson buried in all of this, the kind of lesson history loves to teach through the medium of pure irony. It is very easy to resent your protector in times of peace. It is very easy to mistake the calm that a strong defender provides for a calm that would exist anyway. And it is only when the storm returns that people remember, often too late, exactly why they valued that defender in the first place. Novgorod was about to learn this lesson in the most humbling way possible, and the young prince they had cast aside was about to receive a very interesting invitation indeed, one that would require him to swallow his considerable pride and decide whether saving an ungrateful city was worth the trouble. But that reckoning belongs to the next stretch of our journey, as the nights close in. So let us follow those nights as they come, because the threat that Novgorod so casually invited upon itself was no idle raiding party. The Teutonic Order and their Livonian brethren, whom we met earlier as warrior monks in white mantles marked with black crosses, were among the most formidable fighting men in all of Europe, and now, with Alexander sulking in exile, they pressed their advantage into the wounded Rus lands with methodical confidence. Picture them advancing through the forests and along the frozen roads, disciplined columns of heavy cavalry, foot soldiers, and locally recruited auxiliaries, driven by that potent blend of genuine religious conviction and thoroughly worldly ambition we discussed before. They were not merely raiding, they were conquering, establishing garrisons, planting their authority in the soil, intending to stay. Here is your mainstream fact for the night, and it is the moment the crisis becomes truly dire. The knights captured the city of Pskov. Now Pskov was no minor outpost. It was a significant Rus city, a close neighbour and sometime rival of Novgorod itself, an important stronghold guarding the western approaches. And the manner of its fall makes the episode even more troubling, because Pskov did not fall purely through force of arms. There was treachery involved. Certain factions within the city, whether out of genuine sympathy, political calculation, or simple self-preservation, opened the way for the knights, and Pskov passed into the hands of the order without the kind of desperate siege that had marked the Mongol conquests. The knights installed their own officials to govern the city, and just like that, a major Rus stronghold flew foreign banners. This is your quirky and rather uncomfortable little morsel for the pillow, the reminder that history is never as simple as heroes against villains. Not every Rus welcomed resistance to the West. In these fractured, desperate times, some local leaders calculated that submitting to the Catholic knights might be preferable to the chaos of constant warfare, or might offer advantages in their endless squabbles with rival cities. The betrayal of Pskov was not the act of monsters, but of frightened, pragmatic people making the kind of grim bargains that desperate times produce. Historians still argue about the precise motives of those who opened Pskov to the order, whether it was pro-Western sentiment, factional politics, or mere survival instinct. But the episode stands as a sober reminder that the Rus were never a single unified people heroically resisting foreign domination. They were a scattered, divided, and often self-interested collection of communities, each doing its best to survive an impossible age. With Pskov taken, the knights pushed on, and now they were operating dangerously close to Novgorod's own heartland. They raided and probed established fortified points, and disrupted the trade and territory upon which Novgorod's wealth depended. The chronicles describe the mounting alarm as the enemy grew bolder, striking at settlements ever nearer to the great city, until it became horribly clear that Novgorod itself might be the ultimate target. The proud merchant republic that had so recently congratulated itself on expelling its troublesome prince now found the wolves practically at its gates, and it had, through its own stubborn foolishness, sent away the one man most capable of driving them off. And so we arrive at one of the most satisfying moments of humble pie in all of medieval history. Picture the assembly of Novgorod, that roaring Veche, now considerably less full of bluster as the leading men confront the consequences of their own pride. There is really only one option, and everyone knows it, however much it galls them to admit it. They must ask Alexander to come back. They must swallow their resentment, dispatch envoys to the prince they had cast out, and beg him essentially to return and save them from the disaster they had brought upon themselves. One imagines the delicate diplomatic language required, the careful phrasing designed to make a plea for rescue sound like a gracious invitation. The studious avoidance of the obvious point that this entire crisis might have been averted had they not thrown out their best general in a fit of pique. Here is your mainstream anchor. Alexander did return. Now there is a wrinkle in the tale worth noting, because at first, in some accounts, Novgorod's request was answered not by Alexander himself, but by his brother sent by their father to take up the defense. But the city, it seems, wanted the real thing, the proven hero, the victor of the Neva, and would settle for nothing less. And so Alexander came back to Novgorod, restored to his command, his position considerably strengthened by the simple fact that the city now desperately needed him and knew it. There is a lesson here about leverage, is there not? The man who returns to save those who wronged him returns from a position of enormous strength, because everyone involved understands precisely how much they require his help. Alexander's exile, humiliating as it must have felt at the time, had transformed into a source of power. He came back not as a hired hand to be dismissed at whim, but as the indispensable savior, and that distinction mattered enormously for everything that followed. And Alexander wasted no time. This is the decisiveness we saw at the Neva, now applied to a graver and more complex threat. He moved quickly to recover what had been lost, striking first to retake the territory the knights had seized. He recaptured Pskov, driving out the foreign garrison and restoring the city to Rus control, and dealt harshly with those who had betrayed it, sending a clear message about the price of collaboration. Step by step he pushed the knights back, clearing them from the lands they had occupied, until the order, stung by these reverses, gathered its strength for a decisive confrontation. The knights were not accustomed to being driven off. They were the elite of Christendom's warriors, and they meant to teach this upstart Rus prince a lesson he would not forget. Both sides now understood that a reckoning was coming, a great clash that would decide the fate of the northern frontier. The stage was being set for one of the most famous battles in all of history, a confrontation that would unfold in the dead of winter upon a surface that we have been quietly anticipating since the very beginning of our tale. Do you remember what I told you long ago about ice? About how ice is not merely cold, but terrain opportunity, a thing that can carry a horse or drown one. That knowledge is about to matter more than ever. So here we are at last, at the confrontation you have been quietly waiting for since I first whispered to you about the strange, lethal magic of ice. It is the deep of winter in the year 1242, and the setting is a great frozen lake called Peipus, a vast sheet of ice stretching pale and silent between the Ruslands and the territory held by the knights. Picture it in your mind as you drift here, that immense white expanse under a low grey sky, the snow squeaking underfoot, the air so cold it seems to crackle, and along its shores 2 armies gathering for a battle that will echo down the centuries. This is the moment that seals Alexander's legend forever, the clash remembered as the battle on the ice. Let me set the 2 sides for you. On one side stand the knights of the Teutonic and Livonian orders, along with their allied and auxiliary troops, the elite heavy cavalry of the Catholic West. These are the men we have been building toward, encased in armor, mounted on powerful war horses, trained from youth in the shock tactics that had made Western knights the terror of European battlefields. Their signature maneuver was the massed cavalry charge, a thundering wall of armored men and beasts that could shatter almost any infantry line it struck. On the other side stands Alexander, commanding the forces of Novgorod and its allies, a mixed host of his professional druzhina, town militia, and lightly armored horsemen and foot soldiers. On paper, in a straight fight on open ground, the knights held a fearsome advantage. Their heavy cavalry charge was precisely the kind of blow the Rus had no easy answer for. But Alexander, as we have learned, was not a man to fight on his enemy's terms. Here is your mainstream fact for the knight, the heart of his generalship. Rather than meet the knights where their strengths would dominate, Alexander chose his ground with care, positioning his forces at the edge of the frozen lake in a way that would blunt the power of the enemy's charge. The traditional account holds that he arranged his army cleverly, perhaps placing his weaker militia in the center, where the knights would strike, while concentrating stronger forces on the flanks, so that when the armored wedge of cavalry drove forward into the center, it would push deep but find itself gradually surrounded its flanks, exposed its momentum trapped. It was in essence an invitation. Come and charge my weak center, and let me close around you like a fist. Now picture the battle itself. The knights formed up in their famous wedge, a great arrowhead of armored cavalry, and drove forward across the ice toward the Rus line, that terrifying ground-shaking charge bearing down on Alexander's center. And the center, as planned, gave ground, bending back under the tremendous pressure, drawing the knights deeper and deeper into the mass of the Rus army. The armored wedge, so devastating in the open, now found itself pressed into a churning close-quarters melee, where it could not build up speed for another charge, where its horses became mired in the crush of struggling men, where the very weight and power that made it fearsome became a liability. And then the Rus flanks closed in, and the arrowhead became a trapped and floundering knot of men surrounded on every side. Here is your quirky little morsel, the detail that gives this battle its most enduring and dramatic image. Legend holds that as the battle turned against them and the heavy knights, weighed down by their armor, tried to retreat across the frozen lake, the ice itself began to crack and give way beneath their tremendous weight, plunging armored men and horses into the freezing black water below. The image is unforgettable: proud Crusaders in their gleaming mail, vanishing beneath the ice, dragged down by the very equipment meant to protect them, the lake swallowing them whole. It is one of the most famous scenes in all of medieval warfare, the moment when nature herself seems to side with the defender, when the treacherous ice becomes the great equalizer. Historians still argue quite vigorously over whether the ice actually broke at all. Some of the earliest accounts of the battle do not clearly mention masses of knights drowning through the ice, and a number of modern scholars suspect that this dramatic detail was embellished or added by later chroniclers, or amplified enormously by much later retellings, growing more spectacular with each generation until it became the centerpiece of the legend. Others argue there may well be truth in it, given the season and the setting. We will return to this delicious debate in our next stretch, so hold it lightly for now. What matters here is the outcome, which is not seriously disputed. The knights were defeated, their charge was broken, their formation shattered, and those who could fled back across the lake, pursued by the victorious Rus. Here is your mainstream anchor. The battle on the ice was a genuine and significant victory, and its consequences were real. The defeat halted the eastward push of the Teutonic Order into the Rus lands. It secured Novgorod's western frontier and preserved the independence and the Orthodox faith of the northern Rus against the crusading ambitions of the West. In the aftermath, the Order and Novgorod eventually came to terms with the knights renouncing their claims to the territory they had tried to seize. Whatever the precise details of the fighting, whatever the truth about the cracking ice, the strategic result was clear. Alexander had stopped the western threat cold, and had done so through cleverness and careful use of terrain, rather than through brute strength alone, defeating the elite warriors of Christendom on his own chosen ground. And so the young prince who had earned his name on the river Neva now cemented his legend upon the ice of Lake Peipus. 2 victories, 2 invasions turned back, 2 threats from the west, blunted by a single remarkable commander. He was by now the great defender of the northern Rus, the shield against the Crusaders, the hero of his people. You might think this the triumphant climax of his story, the point at which our prince rides off into glory. But the West, remember, was only one of his 2 enemies, and the greater, more terrible power still waited in the east, watching patient, unbeaten. Alexander's hardest choices still lay ahead. First, though, let us linger a moment longer on that frozen lake and sort the legend from the truth. So let us linger, as promised, on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus, and do the careful, gentle work of separating the shimmering legend from the harder bones of history, because the battle on the ice is one of those events where the story we have inherited and the event that actually occurred may have drifted rather far apart over the centuries. This is the fun part, the detective work. The quiet pleasure of holding a beloved legend up to the light and asking softly how much of you is really true. Let us begin with that unforgettable image, the one that gives the battle its very name in the popular imagination, the knights crashing through the ice and vanishing into the freezing depths. Here is your mainstream fact for the knight delivered honestly. The earliest sources for the battle are surprisingly restrained about this detail. The Rus chronicles closest to the event describe a victory, describe the knights being defeated and driven across the ice, describe the slaughter and the pursuit. But the vivid, spectacular mass, drowning the ice, giving way beneath the weight of the armoured host, is not nearly as prominent or as clear in those early accounts as you might expect for such a famous detail. One important Western source, a chronicle produced within the world of the order itself, mentions the dead falling on the grass, an odd phrase for a battle supposedly fought and decided upon a frozen lake, which some scholars take as a hint that much of the fighting may have happened on or near the shore rather than out on the open ice. So where did the dramatic drowning come from? Here is your quirky little morsel, and it is a revealing one about how history gets made. Much of the spectacular imagery that dominates our modern picture of the battle on the ice owes an enormous debt not to medieval chroniclers, but to the 20th century, and specifically to a legendary film we will discuss properly at the very end of our journey. That film seared into the global imagination the vision of armoured knights plunging through cracking ice, and it did so with such power and artistry that the image became for millions of people the definitive truth of the battle more real in the popular mind than anything in the actual sources. It is a perfect example of how a work of art can reach back in time and reshape our memory of an event, layering its own vivid inventions over the sparse and ambiguous historical record until the two become nearly impossible to untangle. Historians still argue over nearly every quantifiable aspect of this battle, and the range of scholarly opinion is genuinely wide. They argue over how many men actually fought on each side, with estimates ranging from modest bands of a few hundred to much larger hosts, and the truth is probably far smaller than the epic scale that legend prefers. They argue over exactly where on the lake or its shores the battle took place, since the precise location has never been definitively established, and searches of the lakebed have not produced the trove of armour and bones that a mass drowning might be expected to leave behind. They argue over how decisive the battle truly was in the grand sweep of history, with some presenting it as a genuine turning point that saved the Rus from Western conquest, and others suggesting it was one significant engagement among several important, but perhaps not quite the world-altering hinge that later mythology made of it. This is the honest, humbling reality of studying the distant past, that even our most famous and cherished events often rest upon a foundation far more fragile and uncertain than we would like. But here is the crucial thing, and I want you to hold this gently as you rest. To say that the legend was embellished is not to say the battle did not matter. Strip away the cracking ice, reduce the armies to their probably modest true size, acknowledge every uncertainty, and you are still left with a real and meaningful event. A force of Rus warriors, led by a genuinely capable commander, defeated an incursion by the Teutonic Order, and its allies halted their eastward expansion and secured the frontier and the faith of the northern Rus. That happened. The strategic consequence was real, whatever the theatrical details. Alexander really did turn back. The West really did use terrain and tactics with skill, really did preserve his people's independence at a moment of terrible vulnerability. The core of the legend is true even where the ornamentation is doubtful, and there is something worth reflecting on here, in the quiet space between fact and myth, about why the legend grew so large. A people who had been shattered by the Mongols, humiliated, occupied, forced to kneel before a foreign Khan, desperately needed a story of triumph, a moment when the Rus had stood firm and won. The battle on the ice became that story, a shining counterweight to the humiliation of the East, proof that the Rus could still be victorious, still defend themselves, still prevail. It is no accident that the legend grew more spectacular over the centuries, because each generation of a people, under pressure, found in it exactly the reassurance they needed. The cracking ice, the drowning knights, the heroic prince, these were not just history. They were medicine for a wounded national soul. And that, in its own way, is a kind of truth too. A truth about what the story meant rather than what precisely occurred. So let us leave the frozen lake now with our beloved legend gently examined but not destroyed, still standing a little smaller, perhaps a little less certain in its details but no less meaningful in its heart. Alexander Nevsky, victor of the Neva and of the ice, defender of the northern Rus, hero of his people. His reputation was made, his place in memory was secure. The West had been turned back. But now, my friend, we come to the true crossroads of his life, the decision that has divided opinion about him ever since, the choice that no amount of legend can make simple or comfortable. For all his victories against the Crusaders, Alexander understood with brutal clarity that the enemy in the east was of an entirely different order of power, and that, against the Mongols, the sword that had served him so well on the ice would be worse than useless. It would be fatal. And so he faced the hardest decision a proud warrior can face. So now we arrive at the true heart of Alexander's story, the decision that matters far more than any battle, the choice that has made him across the centuries, either a wise savior or a shameful collaborator, depending on who is doing the judging. And I want you to settle in for this one, because it is the most human and the most difficult part of our whole tale, the moment when a proud warrior had to decide whether pride was worth the destruction of his people. Let us lay out the impossible situation plainly, the way Alexander himself must have contemplated it in the cold hours of the night. To the west stood the Crusaders, whom he had beaten twice, formidable, but ultimately containable, an enemy he could fight and defeat with clever tactics and stout defense. But to the east lay the Golden Horde, the western realm of the vast Mongol Empire, an entity of such overwhelming power that the very idea of defeating it in open war was not merely difficult but genuinely delusional. Remember what the Mongols had done to Ryazan, to Vladimir, to Kiev. Remember the fields of skulls and bones. Alexander had watched from his protected northern corner as the greatest cities of his people were erased, and he understood, with a clarity that many of his contemporaries lacked, exactly what resistance to the Mongols purchased. It purchased annihilation. It purchased the total destruction of everything you were trying to protect. Here is your mainstream fact for the night, the strategic logic at the core of his choice. Alexander concluded that the Rus could not fight both enemies at once, and that of the two, the Mongols were both the more powerful and paradoxically the less threatening to what he valued most. The Mongols, for all their brutality, were generally indifferent to religion. They did not care whether the Rus prayed as Orthodox Christians or Catholics or anything else, so long as tribute was paid and order was kept. They demanded submission of the body, taxes and obedience, and the humiliation of kneeling, but they left the soul alone. The West, by contrast, as we discussed, demanded the abandonment of the Orthodox faith and submission to Rome. And so Alexander made his fateful calculation. He would submit to the Mongols, pay their tribute, accept their overlordship, endure every humiliation they demanded, and in exchange he would preserve his people's lives, their faith, and their cultural identity. And he would continue to resist the West, which threatened the very things the Mongols were content to leave untouched. This is a decision of breathtaking pragmatism, and you can feel the weight of it, can you not? This is not the choice of a romantic hero. A romantic hero rides out to die gloriously against impossible odds, banners flying, and is remembered in song for his magnificent, useless courage. Alexander chose the opposite. He chose to bow. He chose humiliation over glory, survival over honor, the long, grim work of endurance over the bright, quick death of defiance. And he did this not out of cowardice, for a coward does not lead cavalry charges at the Neva, but out of a cold and terrible responsibility, the understanding that a leader's duty is to keep his people alive, even when keeping them alive requires him to kneel. Here is your quirky little morsel, and it captures the personal cost of this path. When Alexander travelled to submit to the Mongols, the chronicles record that he was required to participate in various ceremonies of submission, and there is a tradition much debated concerning the rituals demanded of visiting princes at the Horde. Some accounts suggest that princes were expected to pass between fires for purification, and to perform acts of obeisance that to a devout Orthodox Christian skirted uncomfortably close to idolatry or the worship of foreign spirits. There is a famous and poignant contrast here with another Rus Prince Alexander's own contemporary and relative, Michael of Chernigov, who, according to tradition, refused to perform these pagan rituals out of religious conviction and was executed for his defiance, later venerated as a martyr. Alexander, by contrast, found ways to navigate the demands, to give the Mongols the submission they required, without, in his own understanding, betraying his faith. Historians still argue over exactly what was demanded of him and how he reconciled it with his devout orthodoxy. But the contrast between the martyr, who refused, and the survivor who submitted perfectly, captures the moral complexity of his choice. And this is precisely why Alexander remains such a divisive figure right down to the present day. To his admirers, he is the supreme example of wise statesmanship. The leader clear-eyed enough to see that his people could not win, humble enough to swallow his pride for their sake, and shrewd enough to preserve their faith and identity through the darkest of times. In this view, his submission to the Mongols was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. The strength to endure humiliation for a greater good, to play the long game, to bend so that his people would not break. To his critics, however, Alexander looks rather different. Some historians and thinkers have argued that his collaboration with the Mongols set the Rus, and particularly the rising power of Moscow that would descend from his line, on a path of despotism and submission to autocratic authority, that by so thoroughly accepting the Mongol yoke, he helped to shape a political culture of civility that would echo through the centuries. In this darker reading, Alexander is not the noble savior, but the man who taught his people to kneel. Historians still argue over which of these Alexanders is the true one, and the debate is not merely academic, for it touches on deep questions about the very character and history of Russia itself. Was he the pragmatic protector or the collaborator who bent the national spine? Was his choice wisdom or surrender? The answer you reach probably says as much about your own values, about how you weigh survival against dignity, as it does about the man himself. But whatever you conclude, one thing is beyond dispute. Having made his terrible choice, Alexander now had to live it, and living it meant a long and exhausting journey into the very heart of the empire that had devoured his world, to kneel before the Khan and receive permission to rule. And so we turn now to that long road east, into the strange and formidable realm of the Golden Horde. So gather your travelling cloak and your patience, because now you and Alexander set out on a journey so long and so arduous that it is difficult for the modern mind accustomed to crossing continents in a matter of hours to truly grasp its scale. You are leaving the familiar forests and rivers of the Rus behind, and you are riding east and south toward the capital of the Golden Horde, a city called Sarai, which sat upon the lower reaches of the great Volga River, deep in the steppe country that the Mongols had made their own. This was no brief errand. This was a voyage into the belly of the empire, a pilgrimage of submission across hundreds upon hundreds of miles of open grassland. And it was the price a Rus prince had to pay for the right to keep his throne. Let me paint the road for you as you drift along it. The land opens up as you leave the woodlands, the trees thinning until they vanish altogether, and you find yourself in the vast rolling ocean of grass we spoke of at the very beginning. The steppe stretching flat and endless in every fording fall, direction under an enormous sky. The wind never stops. The horizon is so distant it seems to curve. There are no cities here, no comforting walls, only the occasional encampment of nomads, the herds of horses and sheep, and the great emptiness that had bred the most fearsome cavalry the world had ever known. For a man of the forested Rus, it must have felt like travelling to the edge of the world into a landscape utterly foreign and faintly menacing, where the very geography reminded you at every moment that you were far from home and entirely at the mercy of your hosts. Here is your mainstream fact for the night. When Alexander and other Rus princes reached Sarai, they found not the crude camp of savages that Western prejudice might have imagined, but a genuine city, a bustling and cosmopolitan capital that served as the administrative heart of a sophisticated empire. Sarai was a place of considerable size and diversity, home to merchants, craftsmen, officials, and travellers from across the vast Mongol domains, and beyond, a hub of trade and administration where many languages were spoken and goods from distant lands changed hands. The Mongols, for all their reputation as destroyers, were also remarkably effective organisers and administrators, and their capital reflected that, a place of order, wealth, and bureaucratic machinery humming along to keep the enormous empire functioning. Alexander, arriving to kneel and pay tribute, would have found himself in the presence of a power that was not merely brutal but genuinely formidable in its competence and reach. And here is your quirky little morsel to marvel at as you rest. For some princes, and by certain traditions Alexander, among them the journey did not even end at Sarai. To receive the highest confirmations of authority, a prince might be required to travel onward all the way to the distant Mongol heartland, to the great imperial capital at Karakorum in far-off Mongolia, an almost unimaginable distance across the whole breadth of Central Asia. Picture that, a journey of thousands of miles across deserts and mountains, an endless steppe that could take many months in each direction, simply to bow before the supreme ruler of the Mongols and receive a document confirming your right to govern your own home. Envoys and travelers who made such journeys described them as epic ordeals, and the sheer commitment of time and endurance they demanded tells you just how completely the Rus princes were bound into the vast machinery of Mongol power. Historians still argue over the precise details and timing of Alexander's own travels, over exactly when he went where and how far east he ultimately traveled. Since the sources are frustratingly incomplete, but the broad reality is not in doubt. Submission meant the road, and the road was long beyond reckoning. Now consider what these journeys meant for a proud man, and let the psychological weight of it settle over you. Each trip was an exercise in humility, so profound as to be almost a form of penance. You, a prince of ancient Rurikid, blood victor of famous battles, defender of your people, must travel for months across foreign lands to present yourself as a supplicant, to wait upon the pleasure of the Khan, to endure whatever ceremonies and delays and indignities your overlords chose to impose, and to do it all with a composed and cooperative face. Because any sign of pride or resistance might cost you not just your throne, but your life, and might bring fresh destruction upon your people. Remember the martyr Michael of Chernigov, who refused and died. Every prince who made this journey knew that story, knew that the wrong word or the wrong gesture could end everything. It required a kind of iron self-control, a swallowing of pride so complete and so repeated that it must have worn grooves into the soul. And yet, Alexander did it again and again over the years, mastering the delicate art of the submissive supplicant as thoroughly as he had mastered the art of the battlefield commander. There is a strange kind of heroism in this, is there not? A quiet and unglamorous heroism, entirely unlike the shining valor of the Neva or the ice. It is the heroism of the man who endures, who humbles himself over and over for the sake of others, who accepts humiliation as his personal burden so that his people might be spared. Whether you admire him or fault him for the choice he made, you cannot deny the sheer difficulty of living it out, journey after journey, year after year, into the heart of the power that had broken his world. These long roads east became a defining rhythm of the rest of Alexander's life, the recurring pilgrimages of submission that bought survival for his people at the cost of his own comfort and pride. And when he was not travelling to the horde, he was back among the Rus, performing an even more delicate and thankless role, that of the intermediary, the man caught between the demands of the Mongol overlords and the resentment of his own people. For it was one thing to bow before the Khan in distant Sarai. It was quite another to return home and become the instrument through which the Mongols squeezed tribute from an angry and grieving land. So let us come home with Alexander now, back across that endless steppe to the Rus lands, and watch him take up the role that would consume the rest of his life. A role far more thankless and far more corrosive to the spirit than any battle. For it is one thing to bow before a Khan in a distant capital where the humiliation is at least private and far away. It is quite another to return to your own people and become the very hand that reaches into their pockets on behalf of the conqueror. This is the part of Alexander's life that gets far less attention than his glorious victories, and yet in many ways it is the truest measure of the man, the long grey years of grinding, unglamorous, soul-testing service as the Mongols' chosen intermediary. Here is your mainstream fact for the night. In the years following his submission, Alexander rose to become the most senior of the Rus princes, eventually holding the title of Grand Prince, which the Mongols confirmed and supported precisely because he had proven himself reliable, cooperative, and useful to their interests. This is a crucial point to understand about his position. Alexander's authority over the Rus rested in no small part upon Mongol backing. The horde preferred to rule through pliable local rulers rather than governing every corner directly, and Alexander became their favoured instrument, the prince, through whom their will was enforced, their tribute collected, and their order maintained. In exchange for his cooperation, he received their support against rivals and their confirmation of his supremacy. It was a bargain that made him powerful and made him in the eyes of some of his own people an agent of the oppressor. Picture the daily reality of this tightrope walk, because that is exactly what it was, a balancing act performed above a lethal drop. On one side stood the Mongol overlords, demanding their tribute in full and on time, expecting order to be kept, expecting any signs of rebellion to be suppressed, and holding always in reserve the terrible threat of return, the promise that any failure of obedience would bring the horde back to burn and slaughter as they had at Ryazan and Vladimir. On the other side stood Alexander's own people, grieving, resentful, groaning under the burden of taxation, watching their wealth flow away to distant Sarai, and looking to their prince with a complicated mixture of hope, suspicion. And Alexander stood in the middle, absorbing pressure from both directions, trying to satisfy the insatiable demands of the conquerors, while preventing his people from doing anything so rash as to provoke annihilation. Here is your quirky little morsel, and it speaks to the sheer administrative reach of the system Alexander served. The Mongols were meticulous record keepers, and their method of extracting tribute was not crude plunder, but organized systematic taxation, which required knowing exactly how many people lived in the conquered lands, so that the appropriate levies could be calculated. To this end, they conducted censuses, counting the population with bureaucratic precision, a practice utterly foreign and deeply unsettling to the Rus, who had never experienced anything like it. Imagine the alarm of ordinary people when foreign officials arrived to count every household, every hearth, every soul, not out of curiosity, but so that each could be taxed with mathematical thoroughness. There was something almost more frightening about this cold, methodical counting than about open violence, this sense of being catalogued and numbered like livestock in a ledger. Historians still debate the full extent and mechanics of the Mongol census in the Rus lands, but its psychological impact upon a people unused to such intrusion was profound, and it would soon spark exactly the kind of dangerous unrest that Alexander most feared. And this is where his role became truly agonizing, because Alexander understood something his angry people often did not. He understood that resistance to the tribute, however emotionally satisfying, was suicidal. Every instinct of a proud and grieving population cried out to refuse to rebel, to throw off the humiliating yoke. But Alexander, who had seen the fields of skulls, knew that any serious defiance would bring the horde down upon them all, and that the price of a moment's righteous anger would be paid in the total destruction of cities and the massacre of thousands. And so he found himself over and over in the miserable position of urging his own people towards submission, of counseling, patience and obedience, of siding in effect with the oppressor against the natural impulses of the oppressed. He had to swallow not only his own pride, but the pride of his entire nation, and to enforce that swallowing upon people who often hated him for it. You can imagine how this looked to different eyes, and here again we touch the great debate about his character. To those who trusted his judgment, Alexander was the wise father, protecting his children from their own dangerous emotions, absorbing their resentment as the price of keeping them alive. To those who resented him, he was a quisling, a collaborator grown fat and powerful on the suffering of his people, doing the conqueror's dirty work and calling it wisdom. Both views contained truth, and Alexander lived in the painful space between them, unable to fully please anyone, doing the necessary and thankless work that no romantic hero would ever stoop to do. There is a profound loneliness in this kind of leadership, is there not? The warrior who wins a battle is cheered and celebrated, showered with glory and love. But the statesman who prevents a catastrophe that his people cannot even see coming receives no such reward. He is more often blamed for the compromises he makes than thanked for the disasters he averts, because the disaster he prevents remains invisible, a thing that did not happen, while the humiliation he accepts is painfully, visibly real. Alexander spent the long back half of his life performing this invisible, unrewarded service, keeping his people alive through endurance and compromise, earning suspicion where a lesser and more reckless man might have earned love and a glorious, useless death, and the pressure was building. For all Alexander's careful management, his people's patience was not infinite, and the arrival of those Mongol census takers and tax collectors would push certain cities past the breaking point. Rebellion was brewing, the very thing Alexander had devoted his life to preventing, And when it came, he would have to move with all his old speed and cunning, not to fight the Mongols, but to save his people from the consequences of their own defiance. So let us watch the pressure finally burst, because no amount of careful management can hold back an angry people forever, and the moment Alexander had spent his life dreading arrived at last. The immediate spark was exactly what we anticipated: those Mongol census takers and tax collectors moving through the Rus lands, counting and levying with their cold bureaucratic thoroughness. And the resentment that had been simmering beneath the surface for years boiled over into open revolt. Picture it. In certain cities, particularly in the north, the people had reached the end of their endurance. The counting felt like a violation, the taxation like a slow strangulation, and the officials who enforced it became the focus of all the accumulated rage of a conquered people. And so the cities rose. Here is your mainstream fact for the night. Uprisings broke out against the Mongol tax collectors and census officials, with angry crowds turning upon the agents of the horde and in some places killing them or driving them out. Now, from the perspective of the enraged townspeople, this was a glorious act of defiance, a throwing off of the hated yoke, a reclaiming of dignity long trampled. But from Alexander's perspective, watching with the cold clarity of a man who had seen the fields of skulls, it was a catastrophe in the making. The precise nightmare he had devoted his entire life to preventing, because Alexander knew with absolute certainty what the Mongol response to such rebellion would be. The horde did not tolerate the killing of its officials any more than it had tolerated the killing of its envoys all those years ago at the Khalkha. The murder of tax collectors was an invitation to a punitive expedition, and a punitive expedition meant the burning of cities and the slaughter of populations. The very annihilation that Alexander's whole strategy of submission had been designed to avoid. So imagine the horror of his position in that moment. His people had done the emotionally understandable thing, the thing that every proud instinct demanded, and in doing so they had placed their own heads upon the block. And it fell to Alexander once again to save them from themselves, not by fighting the Mongols, which was impossible, but by racing to contain the damage before the horde's vengeance descended. This is your quirky and rather poignant little morsel for the night, the strange inversion of what we normally expect from a hero. In this crisis, Alexander's heroism took the form not of leading a rebellion, but of suppressing one, of hurrying to the horde to plead, negotiate, and smooth over the offence, and of working to restrain his own people from further provocation. There is a tradition that he intervened directly and forcefully to prevent the situation from spiraling into total disaster, using all his accumulated credibility with the Mongols to argue for restraint, to explain to his people's survival with his own reliability and his own humiliating willingness to serve. Consider what this required of him emotionally. He had to side once again, and most painfully, with the oppressor against the natural desire of the oppressed for freedom. He had to tell his own grieving, furious people that their act of defiance had been a terrible mistake, that they must submit again, pay again, bow again, or face extermination. He had to be the voice of grim, unwelcome pragmatism in a moment charged with the intoxicating emotion of rebellion, and he had to travel yet again to the horde to perform yet again the exhausting ritual of the supplicant, this time carrying the far heavier burden of explaining away a genuine offence and begging the conquerors not to unleash their full fury. Historians still argue over the precise details of his interventions during these revolts, over exactly how much he did and how directly he was involved in each incident, since the sources vary and later tradition tended to magnify his role. But the broad shape of it is clear enough. When his people's defiance threatened to bring catastrophe, Alexander threw himself into the breach to prevent it, absorbing the danger, doing the thankless and unglamorous work of averting a massacre. And there is a genuine question that hangs over all of this, one worth turning over gently in your mind as you drift. Was he right? Was his lifelong strategy of submission and restraint truly the wisdom that saved his people? Or was it a kind of learned helplessness that taught the Rus to accept the unacceptable, that extinguished the spark of resistance? That might, in some other timeline, have thrown off the yoke sooner. Those who defend him point to the simple, brutal arithmetic of power, the undeniable fact that the Rus could not have defeated the Mongols in open war, and that every rebellion crushed meant thousands dead for nothing. Those who criticize him wonder whether so thorough an acceptance of servitude did lasting damage to the spirit of a people, whether it embedded a habit of submission that would shape the character of the Rus lands for centuries to come. It is the same great debate we have circled before, and these revolts bring it into the sharpest possible focus. For here we see Alexander not merely accepting his own submission, but enforcing it upon others, using his power to keep his people bowed. But whatever your judgment, the human cost to the man himself is hard to miss. Here was someone who had begun his career as a dashing young victor, cheered and celebrated the shining hero of the Neva and the ice. And here he was now, in the twilight of his life, worn down by endless journeys and endless compromises, spending his final energies not on glorious battles but on the grinding, thankless labor of restraint, talking his own people out of freedom for the sake of their survival, wearing himself thin in the impossible space between conqueror and conquered. The fire of the young warrior had been slowly transmuted into the weary patience of the aging statesman, and the transformation, however necessary, had cost him nearly everything. And it was this final crisis, this last great effort to shield his people from the consequences of their rebellion, that would send Alexander on one more journey to the Horde, a journey from which this time he would not return whole. The years of endurance, the endless roads, the ceaseless weight of impossible responsibility had drained him. His body was failing, and the man who had spent his life keeping his people alive was about to reach the end of his own long and difficult road. So let us walk with Alexander now on his final journey, and I will ask you to soften your heart a little, because we are approaching the quiet end of a long and difficult life, and the man who set out this last time was not the shining young, a warrior we first met, but a weary figure worn thin by decades of impossible burdens. The occasion was another crisis of the kind we have just witnessed, another round of tension between the Mongol overlords and the restless Rus, and once again it fell to Alexander to make the long, exhausting pilgrimage east to the Horde, to smooth over difficulties, to negotiate, to plead, to perform yet again. The endless ritual of the supplicant that had defined the back half of his life. Here is your mainstream fact for the night. Alexander undertook a final journey to the Golden Horde, spending an extended period there, engaged in the delicate diplomacy that was the price of his people's survival. There is a tradition that one of his purposes was to persuade the Mongols not to conscript Rus men into their armies for distant campaigns, to spare his people from being dragged off to fight and die in the Horde's foreign wars, which would have been a devastating burden upon an already suffering land. Whatever the precise diplomatic aims, the mission kept him at the Horde for a long and taxing stretch, and by the time he was finally permitted to depart and turn his face homeward, his health was broken. Whether from illness contracted along the way, from sheer exhaustion, or from some ailment we cannot now diagnose across the gulf of centuries, Alexander fell gravely ill on the long road back. Here is your quirky little morsel, and it is one that has fed suspicion and speculation for a very long time. Because Alexander sickened and died shortly after leaving the Horde, some have wondered both in his own time and since whether his death was entirely natural. It was not unheard of for the Mongols to dispose of princes who had become troublesome or who were no longer useful, and the timing of Alexander's fatal illness striking so soon after his departure from Sarai has led some to whisper of poison. Historians still argue over whether there is any truth to these suspicions, or whether his death was simply the natural end of a body worn out by decades of hardship, endless travel, and crushing responsibility. The honest answer is that we cannot know. The evidence is too thin, the sources too sparse, and the death of an exhausted man in his 40s after a punishing journey requires no sinister explanation. But the shadow of doubt lingers, as it so often does, around the deaths of powerful men, and you are free to let it hang there unresolved as you drift. So picture the scene of his passing, gentle and sorrowful. Alexander, unable to continue his journey home, stopped along the way, his strength failing, and there, far from the great cities he had ruled and defended, the end came for him. In keeping with the deep piety that had guided his whole life, tradition holds that in his final hours he took monastic vows, renouncing the world and embracing the humble robes of a monk, as was the custom for devout Rus princes approaching death. There is something deeply fitting in this final gesture, this laying down of the burdens of power and the taking up of the simple identity of a servant of God, the warrior who had won famous battles, the statesman who had knelt before Khans, the prince who had carried the impossible weight of his people's survival, ended not as a lord, but as a monk stripped of worldly grandeur, meeting his death in humility and prayer. He died in the year 1263, still not an old man worn out in the service of his people. And now here is your mainstream anchor, the reaction that tells you what he meant to those he left behind. When word of Alexander's death reached the Rus lands, the grief was profound. The chronicles record a metropolitan of the church, a senior religious leader, proclaiming to the mourning people that the sun of the Rus land had set, a phrase of such tender and sorrowful beauty that it has echoed through the centuries. The sun of the Rus land had set. Whatever the debates about his choices, whatever the complexity of his legacy, the people of his own time grieved him as a great protector, a shield that had stood between them and destruction, and now was gone. In the darkness of the Mongol yoke, he had been a kind of light, imperfect and compromised perhaps, but a light nonetheless, and his passing left them feeling more exposed and more alone. Let us pause here and consider the shape of the whole life we have followed. He began as a boy of ancient blood lifted onto a war horse before he could barely walk. He rose as a young hero, winning glory on the river and the ice, turning back the Crusaders of the West. And then he made his hardest and most controversial choice, bowing to the Mongols to save what the West would have destroyed, spending the long remainder of his years in the thankless labor of endurance, submission, and restraint, keeping his people alive through humility rather than heroism. It is not a simple story, not a clean tale of triumph, but something more human and more true, the story of a man who did difficult and unglamorous things because he believed they were necessary, and who paid for them with his pride, his comfort, and ultimately his life. But death for Alexander was not the end of his story. In fact, in a strange way, it was only the beginning of his greatest transformation. For a man remembered as the son of the Rus land does not simply fade from memory. The church that he had served so devoutly would come in time to remember him in the most exalted way it knew, lifting him from the ranks of mortal princes into something far greater and more enduring. The warrior who had knelt before Khans would one day be venerated as a saint, a holy protector of the Russian land, and his memory would blaze brighter in death than it ever had in life. And so we turn now to the long afterlife of Alexander Nevsky, and to the remarkable journey by which a compromised and controversial prince became a shining icon of a nation. So let us follow Alexander now into the strange and luminous afterlife of memory, because here is one of the most remarkable things about our prince, that his story does not end with his death, but truly begins a second longer life, the moment his body is laid to rest. The man himself, worn out and compromised, breathing his last as a humble monk on a lonely road, would have had no notion of the towering figure he was about to become in the imagination of his people. For the mortal Alexander, flawed and human, was about to be transformed into something else entirely, a saint, a symbol, a shining protector who would loom over the Russian imagination for centuries to come. Here is your mainstream fact for the night. Not very long after his death, Alexander began to be venerated, and in time the Russian Orthodox Church formally recognized him as a saint, canonizing him as a holy figure worthy of reverence. Now, this is a fascinating thing when you stop to consider it, because sainthood is not usually the reward one expects for a career built on political compromise and submission to a foreign conqueror. But the Church remembered Alexander not for his humiliations, but for what those humiliations had preserved. In their eyes, he had been the great defender of the Orthodox faith, the prince who had turned back the Catholic West that sought to swallow the true Church, and who had shrewdly submitted to the religiously indifferent Mongols precisely so that the Orthodox faith might survive intact beneath their yoke. Seen through this lens, Alexander's entire strategy became not a story of civility but a story of spiritual guardianship, the wise sacrifice of worldly pride for the sake of the eternal soul of the Rus. His bowing to the Mongols was recast as a holy cunning, his refusal to submit to Rome as steadfast faith, and his whole difficult life as the labor of a protector chosen by God to shepherd his people through their darkest hour first. Here is your quirky little morsel, and it captures beautifully how the memory of a man can be shaped and reshaped by the needs of later ages. The image of Alexander that took hold in the religious imagination was that of the holy warrior prince, and over the centuries his relics became objects of great veneration. His tomb a site of pilgrimage, his name invoked protection. Much later, a powerful Russian emperor would move Alexander's relics with enormous ceremony to a grand new monastery in a newly built capital city, deliberately linking the young, modernizing empire to the ancient sainted defender of the Russian land, wrapping his own imperial ambitions in the sacred authority of Nevsky's memory, and a prestigious imperial order of chivalry, a high honor bestowed upon distinguished servants of the state, would be named after him, so that the name of Alexander Nevsky became a mark of the very highest distinction. The compromised prince had become a fountain of legitimacy from which later rulers drank freely, each generation refashioning him to suit its own purposes. And this brings us to a profound truth about how nations remember their heroes, one worth reflecting upon as you rest. The Alexander who was venerated and celebrated in later centuries was in a very real sense a creation of the needs of those later centuries as much as a memory of the actual man. Historians still argue over how much the sainted, heroic Nevsky of national legend truly resembles the flesh and blood prince who lived and struggled in the 13th century, and the honest answer is that the gap between them is considerable. The real Alexander was a pragmatic and controversial political operator navigating an impossible situation with a mixture of cunning courage and painful compromise. The legendary Alexander is a gleaming icon, the perfect holy defender, stripped of ambiguity and doubt, polished into a symbol that each successive age could use for its own ends. Both are real in their way, but they are not the same, and it is worth holding on to that distinction even as you admire the legend. There is something almost poignant in this transformation, is there not? The man himself received so little gratitude in his own lifetime, cast out by ungrateful Novgorod, suspected by his own people for his collaboration, worn down by thankless labor, and dying exhausted and alone on a distant road. And yet in death he received an abundance of honor beyond anything he could have imagined. Elevated to sainthood, celebrated as the son of the Rusland, invoked by emperors, his name a byword for glory. The invisible service he performed in life, the disasters he quietly averted, the survival he purchased through his own humiliation. All of this was finally belatedly recognized, though he was long past being able to enjoy it. It is a common pattern in history that the true value of a difficult leader is often understood only in retrospect, once the compromises he made have safely faded, and only their protective results remain. And consider, too, how the meaning of Alexander shifted with the meaning of Russia itself. As the scattered principalities of the Rus eventually coalesced over long centuries into a great and powerful state, centered on Moscow, a state that would grow into an empire and then into a mighty modern nation, Alexander was retroactively enlisted as one of its founding heroes, a symbol of Russian identity, resilience, and destiny. His descendants through the line of Moscow would become the rulers who finally threw off the Mongol yoke and built an empire of their own, and so Alexander could be seen as a kind of patient founding father, the man who had kept the flame alive through the dark centuries so that his heirs might one day blaze forth in glory. Whether this is fair history or convenient myth is again a matter of endless debate, but there is no denying the power of the story. And it is precisely this power, this ability of Alexander's memory to be summoned and shaped to serve the needs of the living that would reach its most spectacular expression. Not in a church or a monastery, but on a movie screen in the meeting. Darkest and most dangerous years of the 20th century, when a great nation once again faced enemies from the West and reached back across 700 years to summon the son of the Rusland to fight for them once more. So let us make one final leap across the centuries all the way to the 20th, because the strangest chapter of Alexander's afterlife unfolds not in the medieval world at all, but in the flickering darkness of a movie theatre, and it is here that the legend we have been examining took on the gleaming, unforgettable form that still shapes how the world remembers him. The great Soviet filmmaker, Sergei Eisenstein, created a film simply titled Alexander Nevsky, and it is no exaggeration to say that this single work of art did more to define the popular image of our prince than 700 years of arc. chronicles and church veneration combined. Remember when I told you long ago on that frozen lake that much of our vivid picture of the battle on the ice owes its power to a legendary film? This is that film, and now you understand why I promised we would return to it. Here is your mainstream fact for the night. Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky was a masterpiece of cinema, its climactic battle on the ice, a sequence of such artistry and power that it has influenced filmmakers ever since, and its score, composed by the great Sergei Prokofiev, remains one of the most celebrated marriages of music and image in film history. But the film was also unmistakably a work of propaganda made at a moment of enormous political tension. It was produced as the shadow of Nazi Germany loomed ever larger over Europe, and the film's message was about as subtle as a thrown brick. The armoured Teutonic Knights, the invaders from the west with their menacing helmets and their crusading arrogance, were transparently meant to evoke the German threat of Eisenstein's own day, and Alexander's triumph over them was a rousing call to Russian patriotism and resistance. The medieval prince was resurrected as a weapon of modern statecraft, summoned across the centuries to steel a nation against a new invader from the west. And here is your quirky little morsel, one of the most delicious ironies in the whole history of cinema. The film was completed and released to great acclaim, and then quite suddenly it vanished from view. Why? Because of the shifting winds of politics we glimpsed at the very beginning of our journey. Not long after the film's release, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a pact of non-aggression, and abruptly a rousing anti-German film became a diplomatic embarrassment. The picture was quietly withdrawn from circulation, shelved, made to disappear its powerful message, inconvenient to the new political friendship. And then when that friendship shattered and Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the film was hurriedly brought back, dusted off and pressed into service once more as a patriotic rallying cry, more relevant and more useful than ever. Alexander Nevsky, the man who had spent his life balancing between two mortal enemies, found even his cinematic ghost balanced between propaganda campaigns, shelved and unshelved according to the convenience of the powerful. He simply could not escape being useful to whoever happened to be in charge. Historians and critics still argue over how to weigh Eisenstein's film, over how much it distorted the historical Alexander in service of its political message, over whether its magnificent artistry excuses or compounds its function as propaganda. And this brings us back one final time to the great theme that has run through our entire tale: the endless malleability of Alexander's memory, the way each age reaches back and refashions him for its own purposes. The Church made him a saint, the emperors made him a symbol of imperial legitimacy, the Soviet state made him a patriotic hero against fascism, and in modern Russia, his image continues to be invoked, celebrated, and deployed, a national icon, summoned again and again to embody strength, faith, and resistance. He was even, in a recent nationwide poll voted by the Russian public as among the greatest figures in their entire history, 7 centuries after his death, still blazing in the national imagination. And so we arrive at last at the end of our journey with a fuller and more honest understanding of the man than any single legend could offer. We have seen the boy of ancient blood lifted onto a war horse. We have seen the young hero of the Neva and the ice turning back the Crusaders of the West. We have seen the hardest choice of his life, the fateful decision to bow to the Mongols in order to save what the West would have destroyed. We have seen the long, thankless years of submission and endurance, the grinding labour of the intermediary, the suppression of his own people's revolts, the exhausting journeys east. We have seen his lonely death and his glorious resurrection as saint and symbol. And through it all we have held on to the central difficult question whether he was the wise saviour or the collaborator who taught his people to kneel, a question that has no easy answer and perhaps never will. And now, my dear listener, it is time to let all of it go, to release the frozen lakes and the burning cities, the thundering cavalry and the endless steppe, and to drift softly back toward the warmth of your own quiet room. Let the great white expanse of Lake Peipus fade gently now into stillness, the ice growing smooth and calm, the clash of armies dissolving into silence, the shouting of the Veche softening into nothing more than a distant, half-remembered hum. Let the long roads to the horde grow dim and grassy, and peaceful the dust, settling the horizon, blurring into a soft and dreamless grey. The old prince has laid down his burdens at last, and so may you lay down yours. All the striving and the struggle, all the impossible choices and the thankless labour, all of it belongs now to the deep and gentle past, resting quietly beneath the centuries like snow settling over a silent field. The candles of that distant age are guttering low, one by one, their small flames flickering and fading into the dark. The sun of the Rusland set long, long ago, and its people have long since found their rest, and the world they knew has grown quiet and still and kind. There is nothing left to fear now, nothing to decide, nothing to carry. The battles are all ended. The journeys are all complete. The great and troubled heart of that faraway prince has been at peace for more than 700 years, and tonight at last you may share in that same deep and untroubled peace. The stars are dimming softly overhead, the night has wrapped the whole world in its gentle hush, and everything everywhere is finally perfectly still. Close your eyes now. The story is over, the lamps are out, and it is time at long last for deep and restful sleep.